a new seminar for a new version of our webinars, Fueling Tomorrow, for the Asia SAF Industry Series. So we're going to see our speakers a bit later. Before we introduce them and Gabriel introduce them to you guys, we wanted to give you a bit of last updates of what's happening at what happened recently at ASAFA. And we had some exciting news recently, and also to share with you our upcoming events in Asia Pacific region. Gabriel, can we move to the maybe next slide, please? All right, so quickly, who we are for the one who don't know us. So we are Asia's first and only independent, neutral, non-profit industry association, fully dedicated to the aviation decarbonization and to the promotion of SAF, sustainable aviation fuels, in the region. So we aggregate, as on our platform, the whole SAF ecosystem to make sure that, you know, when we speak with one voice, and we don't finger point at anybody. At the opposite, we speak as all ecosystem industry toward government people. So it's important to us that we also, as you say, independent, meaning that we don't provide or support one single country from the region. In fact, we are pushing for the region as a whole. We also not push for one single industry, but really for the whole ecosystem, which include airlines, fuel producers, technology licensors, feedstock aggregators, investors, OEMs, policymakers, and so on, right? So that's very important to us. That's what makes our credibility, and that's why we are getting more and more momentum. So, and as you'll see on the next slide, Gabriel. Yeah. So now we have reached 28 international members and partners across the SAF ecosystem. The last one joining are Tripatra from Indonesia, which we announced today on our social media and our website. And also as well, recently, we had 3 other associations, one from India, SAF Association from India, the Axe for Sky from Japan, and a Federation of the Industry Renewable Energy Industry Club, with whom we signed some partnership agreements to develop SAF at India, Japan, and Thailand, but also internationally at the regional level. Next, please. So, Gabriel, maybe you want to say a few words about our survey and our policy summit?
All right.
Please.
Yeah, thanks for that, Fabrice. In 6 weeks from now, probably, we'll be holding the first One Sky Policy Summit here in Singapore. The idea is we really want to really bring in the whole industry along with policymakers across energy, civil aviation, trade, carbon markets to really come together to really actively discuss SAF in a very neutral setting. At the same time, I think policymakers also get a bit of, let's say, experience talking to the industry, learning about latest projects, developments, and challenges. You can scan the QR code a bit for more information, but really we'd like to offer again some perks for members and those attending our webinar. There's going to be a 10% so-called discount if you use the code ASAFA SAF10. And we're again happy to take some questions about what you expect to see. Right now, there are about at least 280 people who have signed up. We expect up to close to 400. We're getting there. So we need your support to really make this happen. And we look forward to seeing you here in Singapore on the 24th to 26th. The next bit as well, I think that's interesting for us. We've been doing this survey for since September. The idea is we really want to really hear from you, from the industry, from policymakers and industry. What do you expect for SAF comes 2030? It's quite easy. Just scan the QR code and log in. And just scan the QR code, fill out the questionnaire. It takes about 5 to 10 minutes. Really, we see already we got some responses about how much SAF will be, likely to happen 2030. Is it 5%? Is it 7%? All these responses were then collated in an anonymous manner as part of our SAF Outlook report to be published in November. That will be again publicly available. We're going to do more webinars and dissemination on that. The idea is really to keep this going every year, where we really get to hear from the industry, what's happening in Asia, recommendations for the industry, for policymakers to consider. and really make SAF happen in real time. With that, I think we really bring to our, again, specialists and experts today at the panel. We actually have distinguished guests from 1.5, Ms. Sylvia Low, Sujimori-san, and of course, Mr. Philip New, who's actually a veteran in the industry. We put out the profiles quite a bit already, but I think they all come from, let's say, unique sectors of the industry. Sylvia herself was from Occidental Petroleum, but now she leads 1.5's CDR business here in Asia. Sujimori-san is actually a veteran back in ANA. We all actually understand ANA was early days leaders in promoting SAF and decarbonization. He's now joined the 1.5 team. Philip's also based in the UK and Europe. He's worked in many, many places, and now of the many hats, he is part of the Mission Possible Partnership, which is again a group, a non-profit group looking at how to decarbonize industries at scale at a systems level. And without further ado, I think I'll hand the floor over to our panelists. And since we do have a small group today, not only just use the text boxes, but feel free to raise your hands. We can get you to speak. CDR is a really, really fascinating topic. It's really part of the ICAO's really long-term vision to really decarbonize the industry. So really, what better way to really understand more, but from the experts themselves. So really hand the floor over to the audiences and our speakers. Thank you. Oh yeah, and that's always the survey. I'll stop my screen. Sylvia, do you wanna chime
You.
in to share your slides?
Thank you, Gabriel. Let me try to cast my slides to see if everyone can see the first page.
Loading.
I think it's working. Brilliant. Okay. All right. So hi everyone. My name is Sylvia. I think Gabriel did an excellent introduction of all of us, so I would not talk about that too much. Perhaps I can start by introducing my company. It's called 1.5. It is a fully owned subsidiary of Occidental. We are an oil and gas upstream producer. Under this division, we also invest in different forms of carbon management solutions. And one of the things that we have heavily invested in is carbon engineering's direct air capture technology. And what this technology does is that it captures carbon dioxide from the air, and we sequester it into underground storage, naturally forming storage facilities like in or expired oil wells or saline aquifers, or we can also collect the CO2 and then make use of it to make future fuels. We'll talk a little bit more about it later. Today, we want to spend time talking about SAF, and it is a topic that not many people have explored, because most of the time when you discuss about SAF, it's a very new fuel. We talk about feedstocks, we talk about technology, we talk about mandates and demand mandates in different countries to stimulate the industry to grow. This presentation is really about how do you price SAF properly in the market that will allow the market to scale in a way that the industry expects. And then what I will do is to introduce how carbon credits arising from direct air capture can help aid in this process. So without further ado, let me dive into the presentation. This is just a standard disclaimer. I won't talk much about it.
In our system, CO2 is captured into a...
So this slide here talks about our technology in a very, very quick way. And I'm Sugimori-san or myself, we are here to answer any questions. If you have more technical questions, we can answer them as well. But this is a really cool slide that tells you what our technology is about.
In our system, CO2 is captured into a liquid that is continuously distributed over a corrugated plastic packing, a material that puts a huge surface area into a small volume. CO2 is a weak acid, so it wants to bind with a strong base in our water-based capture solution. The CO2-rich capture solution is then gathered together and piped to a chemical recovery unit, where the CO2 is extracted and the regenerated capture solution is piped back to the contactor to begin the process again. In our system, CO2 is captured
Okay, let's move on.
into a liquid. In our system,
Okay, so now that you know about this technology and how we actually go about capturing the CO2 from the air, perhaps we can talk about how we see this product being used in the market, how we categorize it. So a lot of times we get questions related to what's the difference between capturing CO2 from the air and capturing it from point source. When we say point source, is from a facility that is burning fossil fuel, and then CO2 gets emitted in the atmosphere through its flue stack. So this diagram here shows, I think, quite well what the difference is and how it applies to the airline industry. So if you have 1 ton of CO2 emitted, and then you add 1 ton of CO2 avoided somewhere else. When I say avoided, in the carbon credit world, there's 2 types of credits. One is a removal, which is what we do, capturing it from the air, and the other one is reduction. Under the world of reduction, there are emissions that are reduced because you're switching from fossil fuel to something else. That's a reduction credit. If you were to avoid the emission because you have switched to like on cook stove from burning biomass to using solar panels to create heat, that's also avoidance credit. So if you were to use those carbon credits, which are all classified as carbon credits, like carbon removal credits, you are avoiding an emission that is happening somewhere else in the world caused by something else other than burning it in the plane. So what happens then on the top side, you will see that the CO2 is still emitted from the plane even though it was avoided somewhere else. What we're proposing here, and it's aligned with many different studies, is that when the ton of emission is emitted from the plane, you can permanently remove it using carbon removal credits. And then it's only in that scenario that you are able to achieve the climate benefit through a net zero aligned portfolio. So I hope this clarifies the difference between removals and reductions in addressing residual emissions. Now, for people who are working in the aviation industry, they will be quite familiar with these long-term aspirational goals that ICAO has. And they generally classified it into 3 different scenarios. And the 3 scenarios talks about possibilities of new fuels emerging and having an impact of substituting the current fossil jet that is being used in the planes. And the first scenario is the least aggressive one, or least optimistic one in terms of newer fuels, and the IS3 is the most optimistic. And the differences basically is the amount of fuel that is being used in the categories of lower carbon aviation fuel, using cryogenic hydrogen, using CO2 based fuels, and using gaseous based fuels. So for 1.5, we also can produce SAF using the CO2 we captured, and that's under the category of LTEC SAF, atmospheric CO2 based fuels. So what we can see here, and what I want to point out, is that the gray segment here can either be really big in IS1 or really small, but nevertheless, there always is a residual emission that at the end of even 2050, 2070, there is an amount of residual emissions arising from manufacturing the SAF in the plants, which needs to be addressed. And it is in no way insignificant. In IS1, it's rather large, as you can see, even as we go towards 2050, 2070, and in a very optimistic scenario where there are many different alternative fuels, is still a significant number of 203 million tons of CO2. Now, I talked a little bit about this earlier. The 3 categories that 1.5C technology can address through our carbon capture is in the manufacture of power to liquids. Using atmospheric CO2 combined with green hydrogen, we can make SAF. The second one would be in the category of lower carbon petroleum fuels, or what they call lower carbon aviation fuels, where jet fuel manufactured from crude oil that is lower in carbon intensity because they've employed carbon capture or using lower carbon intensity fuels in the process of its life cycle. They are able to create a carbon intensity that is lower than 89 grams per megajoule. So the last one is the residual emission, which I talked about, the gray section, which is very big, or still significant as you move from IS1 to IS3. So how do we address that? Is in the form of carbon credits. We capture the CO2 from the air, we store it underground, we monitor it for thousands of years, and that becomes a carbon credit that's certified by registries through recognized methodologies and monitored over time. And we can use those carbon credits to reduce the emissions, and you can consider those emissions either with emissions within the aviation sector, or you can also consider that as a means of reducing the carbon intensity of the SAF that's being produced in each of these SAF technologies. Okay. Any questions so far? No?
Anyone from the audiences
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
You can type them in the chat box as well.
All right. I'm not sure if I can see it, so Gabriel, I mean, I rely
I'll
on.
read it out. Yeah.
Okay. So so what I would like to move on to, now that we've talked about the aspirations as written out by ICAO, is what are the different countries doing about it? Now, as we all know, ICAO accepts anything from SAF to carbon credits, and carbon credits are far less expensive than SAF. So our focus here is on SAF. And because of that, countries themselves will have to find ways to create that demand internally, because if left on its own, the obvious choice for a commercial business is to find the lowest cost solution. So what governments have done is that they have come together and thought of different incentive programs to help SAF stimulate the demand for SAF. And what we've noticed is that there's a spectrum of policies that is being introduced, and they're all slightly different from one another, although they are there to stimulate both demand and supply. So let's talk about the different types of policies. Like to categorize it. You can categorize it in many ways, but for us here, we categorize in three categories: volume focused, carbon intensity focused, and carbon solutions focused. And we're all in Asia. I mean, I think we're all in Asia, except for Philip. Most of us are in Asia, and most of the SAF policies that I've seen to date are all volume focused. Now that might change over time because they're quite new. What that means is that the government comes up with targets where they are obligating the producers to produce, or the blenders to blend, or the buyers to buy. Is a percentage of the volume that is expected to be blended to the current jet fuel pool. And that's it. It's a volume target, nothing else. The Singapore SAF mandate is somewhat like that. They haven't stipulated a carbon intensity target or a guideline. All they said was 3 to 5% between 2026 and 2030. And the way they carry it out is through a estimated price at that time of purchase of what a 1% or 2% is. And then they collect the money through the air tickets as a tax amount. And from that amount they collect, they would buy SAF, probably through an auction. And then that amount is blended into the fuel pool at the airport, and then the airlines buy, and that's it. That's Singapore. Japan, Korea, all over Asia, somewhat the same, different volumes. Yeah, and they might change over time, but we were just watching so far. For the UK SAF mandate, they are much further along. in terms of the design and the rollout execution of the mandate. I think I'll let Philip talk about it later, but in general, it's a carbon intensity focus. And I'd like to elaborate on that a little bit. Carbon intensity of the SAF, not of the fuel pool. And what they did is that they stipulated a blend of SAF whose respective volumes adjusted on a scale relative to 70% CI baseline reduction. What does that mean? What that means is that the government wants to have a 70% CI reduction for SAF on the fuel pool, on the SAF, on the neat SAF, but they can't find a exact 70%. So what they did is that they use volume as an adjustment on how much SAF needs to be blended depending on what that SAF embodies. So for example, if I produce a SAF that is producing greater than 70% reduction, then you're given a pass. You can produce less or you can buy less. But if you produce something that is lower than 70%, so it's more carbon intensive, then you will have to produce more of it to attain the same percentage of reduction in the fuel pool. So because it's volumetrically adjusted, then what that means is that a higher reduction means that the fuel pool supply is smaller, and hopefully it will create a higher bid price for the product. And if the carbon intensity is not as intensive or lower reduction, then you have to produce more of it. So what that means is that it's good because they are recognizing the different carbon intensity in different SAF. But like I said, when you produce a carbon intensity that is not as high in reduction, then you're producing more. When you produce more, it will have an adverse effect in the market because when supply goes up and there's no demand for it, then you are basically competing amongst yourself more and there'll be price pressure. So it has an impact on volume. Whereas on the volume focused one, you might buy the cheapest SAF, but that cheapest SAF might not give you the carbon reduction that airlines want because they need to adhere to a reduction target by ICAO. Now, there's another one which is, There's another one which is carbon solutions focused. So in California, they focus more on, firstly, carbon intensity is there as well. They're looking at the carbon intensity of the entire fuel pool. So they're not just looking at the neat biofuels. They're looking at the carbon intensity of the current fuel pool being 100% fossil-based, and they want to reduce it over time by blending more and more biofuels. So they are allowing they're allowing different solutions to allow the carbon intensity of the fuel pool to come down. So one of them is blending renewable diesel. You can also run more or supply more hydrogen. There's hydrogen fueling in California. You can the build-up of the facility itself, which has nothing to do with the fuel pool carbon intensity, is also creating some credits. And also for our DEC credits, we can also sell into this, or we can sell to blenders, and that will also result in a lowering of the carbon intensity of the fuel. So they are more focused on the types of solutions and what carbon intensity it can bring down rather than the fuel itself. So what that does is that the biofuels in the end competes with many different types of solutions, not just within the biofuels itself. So none of these solutions are, advantages relative to the other. There's pros and cons, but I think it's important to understand the differences so that we know what can be designed that is suited for each region. So any questions so far? No. All right. So in SAF, right, for any commercial business to survive, you need to manage cost and you need to understand your revenue stream, because the difference of the two is your profit, basically. You have no profit, you can't pay for the cost incurred, the business can't survive. So for me, I've always looked at the SAF market in a few different ways. Firstly, the feedstock needs to be available. Secondly, the technology needs to be available. And the third thing, which I find that no one has really talked about, is what is the fair market price of SAF that will allow the producers to have a stable income or manageable profit over time. And I think this point is the reason why there are certain things being observed in the market. So if you look at the box section, you can see that these are the two things that are being discussed in some conferences that I managed to pull out. And the first thing is there is inconsistent price mechanism in SAF contracts. So this is the survey done by BNEF. They surveyed 21 SAF market participants across 14 different companies, and they found this information. 44% of SAF supply is indexed to fossil jet or other commodity prices. It could be Brent crude. 31% is fixed price, and 25% is linked to SAF production costs. Now, for a SAF producer, they would be very happy for it to be linked to SAF production costs, because all they need to do is that it's linked to a floating price of my feedstock, which is exactly what I'm paying. I can't fix the price of it because biomass is in short supply and it probably will only go up. And then I can control my processing costs, and then I'll just sell the end product to the airlines. So for the airlines, they would have a problem, because what if the price of biofuel gets really expensive because of the lack of supply of feedstock? For the producer, it's okay because they have just put off the risk to airlines, but for the airlines, it's not okay. So this is not the makings of a fair market price in a contract. Now, if you look at the other ones, 44% indexed to jet fuel and 31% to fixed price. Most of the time, nobody will accept a fixed price for long because you don't know what the future beholds. And I don't know this for sure, but most likely they would hedge it to a fixed price of something else, so make it a floating price. So if I buy fixed price something, I will hedge it to a floating price, let's say jet fuel. So I lock in the premium that I'm getting relative to jet fuel. So essentially, if you look at the 44 and 31%, about 75% of the contracts out there is most likely linked to a floating price of jet fuel. Now, for an airline, you might say that, well, I take a view on the premium of SAF being $2,000 per metric ton, and I'm willing to take that risk for 1 or 2 years. But am I willing to take that risk for 5 to 10 years? I don't know. And I'm currently buying jet fuel for my plane, but if another COVID happens, what I can do is that I can turn around and sell my term contracts into the jet market, which is completely liquid. But if you were to buy SAF, can you do the same for SAF? I don't know. So the issue is that the jet fuel market is mature, and there's ways that you can turn around and sell the inventory that you have. But for SAF, it's not as easy. And because of this, it's resulting in what they are observing today as shrinking contract timescales. So when you have a shrinking contract and you have a huge capital investment upfront, especially for certain technologies outside of HEFA, you need to borrow money from the bank. There is no offtake agreements. It's actually inhibiting a lot of supply coming in, not because of the feedstock not being available. It's just that it's very difficult to get the right financing to build the plant without subsidies. So what is the correct pricing mechanism for SAF? This is the question that I think as an industry, we should try to answer, right? So I will try to answer that with a solution. And the solution I think can be considered is if countries can set a carbon intensity threshold on SAF. Why? Well, I repeat again, all the SAF have different carbon intensities and they all individually are selling as if they are different products. But in reality, SAF, is a drop-in fuel. It's exactly the same. The only difference is its carbon intensity. And that's very important because if you produce something that has low carbon intensity, you should be given a premium. If you produce something of high carbon intensity, you should be given a discount to the price of that that premium product. And so here I'm going to tell you what that recommendation is. Now, if you were to put a carbon intensity threshold, what that means is that, and if you look at the left-hand side, you have production costs, different technologies. I included LCAF in there just to show the differences, because what I want to show is that an LCAF, which is essentially means to which a jet fuel supplier can reduce its carbon. Hang on, someone's calling. So LCAF is a way that upstream oil and gas can reduce their carbon intensity, and the cost of doing that is actually not as high as producing a SAF. And so the abatement cost is very low. So for those people who don't understand, abatement cost is the price of producing SAF, the SAF price, minus the jet price, divided by the carbon intensity of which it's reduced. And so for LCAF, the cost of reducing is very low, but actually the amount of carbon intensity is reduced in each molecule of LCAF is very low because you can only reduce a certain very small percentage in its in each molecule of LCAF. Now, if you were to look at the cost stacking of its production from left to right in the rising cost, you would also find that certain type of SAF, although it's cheap to produce, it actually has a very high abatement cost because the amount of carbon intensity is reduced from the production is very low. So how do you bring all these together? The way you bring all this together is that you can get a jurisdiction, and it's not Corsair because the country needs to set the requirements for the fuel. And what they can do is they can say, well, I think that I would like my country to produce a reduction of 70%, like what UK has done, 70% reduction in fuel in carbon intensity of SAF, put the requirement there and allow the market to create a blend that would then meet that 70% CI reduction. And then what happens is that you have different types of SAF, whether it's with CCS or without CCS, alcohol to jet, or HEFA or Fischer-Tropsch with different carbon intensity blended together to meet that threshold. And what we are proposing is to use removal credits, DAC removal credits, to complement it. So what this does is that it is not a replacement to SAF. It is only used when the carbon intensity threshold is not met with the SAF alone. So you can actually blend something like alcohol to jet with HEFA to meet in different ratios to meet the threshold. If you can't meet it, you can use removal credits because the reality is that we don't know how much volume of HEFA there is. We don't know how much alcohol to jet there is. There might not be enough. There might be different reasons why the plant cannot come on time. The other thing is that it's very difficult to get to a very specific carbon intensity threshold. And if you don't meet it, you can have giveaway. So let's say you reduce it by 72%. But the threshold is only 70%. You've given away 2% for free. So because carbon credits is completely able to be fractionalized to any amount, it's a carbon credit, it's like a paper instrument. You can use it as a complement. So when you have a threshold and a variety of SAF that can make one type of SAF, you have now created a critical mass where price visibility and trading can happen. And then you create a benchmark. Now, remember I said earlier on, everyone is using jet fuel. Everyone is using jet fuel because why did everyone gravitate to jet fuel as a benchmark? Because there's a lack of better instrument. If someone can create a threshold for SAF where all the variants can come together, you can now create a benchmark SAF. And what will happen is that anything that produces 70% reduction and above will price at the premium to that threshold, that benchmark. Anything below will price at a discount. And that way, the benchmark is a reflection of the overall SAF market, not something that is totally different from SAF, like a fossil pathway. Okay, so now that I hope everyone understands what I mean by a benchmark, a SAF benchmark for different variants of SAF, I also want to show why do we want to use DAC? Why not something else, you know? So I can think of a few reasons why, but firstly, I want to explain to you the price of DAC credits. So we are one of the I would say we are the biggest producer of atmospheric CO2 capture in the world. Our plant is being built. I will show you later. And we are able to achieve the carbon credit, removal credit at a very reasonable price. So the price that we are expecting, I can't tell you exactly, but it's between $400 to $600 per metric ton. And if you were to combine our carbon credit with different technologies, as you can see here, UCO, sugar, municipal waste using Fischer-Tropsch, or alcohol to jet, if you were to not combine it at all, no CI threshold, the original SAF, you will get the dark green price. If you were to include CDR credits to reach 15% CI, what I mean by 15% is it's only 15% from zero. So it's actually 85% reduced in carbon intensity. And then if you were to take it all the way down to zero, that means no carbon intensity of the SAF at all, what you will see is the price going down, because the weighted average price of the carbon credit and the carbon reduction credit from SAF itself actually goes down because the price of DAC credit is lower than the price of SAF. And it gets more significant as you go into the higher cost categories of producing SAF, like sugar, alcohol to jet, municipal waste, and agri-waste. And what this does is a few things. You're actually bringing a product to market using this with the SAF itself much lower than what you would be able to give with the product alone. And the second thing is, well, you have all these four technologies. They all compete side by side with each other. As you can see, the 15% mark, which is the middle one, HEFA is the cheapest, followed by sugar, followed by municipal waste and agri-waste. And why would anybody buy anything to the right? They will start buying HEFA first. Well, by allowing DAC credit to be added, you are also bringing the more expensive technologies to market earlier. So this line shows the gap between the lowest price SAF and the highest price SAF, and the lowest, and then with the carbon reduced to zero, you are able to reduce the gradient of the price difference between HEFA and alcohol to jet agri-waste. So what that means is that it's partly able to create a much cheaper product for the more higher technology, more capital intensive SAF that's being produced. And that way you are bringing more supply to the market quicker to be able to attain the goals that's being set by ICAO. Okay, so now that I've mentioned that, to cast the net of even wider, actually CDR credits can be used for anything. What we've talked about is how you can pair CO2 with sustainable aviation fuel. to get to a certain percentage of CI fuel. It can be 0%, 5%, 10%. It's really up to the ambition of each jurisdiction to set those standards. And then you can also pair it with lower carbon aviation fuel, or in fact, even jet fuel. Now, we're not saying that we want to explore all three. In fact, most countries are at probably the stage of trying to incentivize SAF production right now. So if we were to keep to the top segment and see how CDR credits can itself help the SAF market get to market quicker, then over time, as more and more SAF gets produced and we realize that we're meeting, a supply constraints on the feedstock, then other channels can be there and also can be applied to lower carbon aviation fuel or fossil fuel. So with that, I think I end the presentation with this slide to show that actually doing this has many, many benefits. It benefits the government, it benefits the airlines, the SAF producer. Of course, why we're doing this is because it also would allow us to create market for our product to come into market. So let's go through all of them. The governments, you are essentially creating jobs and for two markets, not just one. You're creating one for the fuel and you're creating one for carbon credits. It promotes energy security because what it does is that when you have price clarity, especially for Singapore, you need to attract supply to this small country. You have Nestle, no doubt, but then when you create a price clarity, other countries can produce their own SAF and they can export it. They will know the price point to which they need to produce to be able to export to meet the demand coming from Singapore. And so why do I say energy security? Because energy security is not about getting a supply from one source and I have enough and that's it. Energy security is about diversifying your fuel sources from multiple locations. And only with that, then you have energy security, because if one source goes down, you have another source. And single price point for SAF. Why is that good? We talked about that a lot. When government gives subsidies, it's often given in the light of a certain timeline. Okay, I only give you to you for 5 years, but you don't know what happens during the 5 years. When you have a price point between the benchmark and let's say power to liquids, which is very, very expensive, and as that benchmark gravitates, moves over time, it will definitely go up, right? If it goes up and close a gap between power to liquids and that benchmark, then you know that the subsidies will dwindle over time. It gives you a guideline instead of a finite timeline, which may or may not fit the product. You also have line of sight for SAF pathways to enter the market. Instead of saying that, hey, I want subsidies for blah, 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 you will know that, hey, for HEFA, the price is going up. In 1 year's time, 2 years' time, I think the price based on the projections of supply is going to hit another price. And then with that, you can plan your SAF plants for alcohol to jet, for Fischer-Tropsch to be ready in that future timeline. You have also a lower weighted average cost of abatement per unit of SAF, because as I mentioned earlier, when you blend the stack credits into SAF, you're actually able to lower the price of the SAF itself because the SAF reduction price is higher than the credit. Then fourthly, you also have ease of purchase and downstream carbon allocation. Imagine a world where you have like 20 different types of SAF. How is the airline going to choose which one to buy at any point in time? If a country can consolidate all the different SAF into one single carbon intensity and say, this is the price of this carbon intensity SAF, it doesn't matter where it comes from, it doesn't matter which technology it comes from, it's SAF, 70% reduction. You are also able to sell it to the airline. The airline can then allocate it to their customers, be it passengers or cargo freight forwarders, or even companies that are sending their employees for travel. The buyers face common set of cost pressures. It's also simplifying it in terms of competition between airlines. Is buying early, buying late. That's the only thing they care about right now for jet fuel. But now they have to think about what kind of technologies to buy. When should I buy it? What should I support? Do I give a 5-year offtake or 10-year offtake? It's very confusing. Then there's the ability to price premium and hedge risk. In the future, similar to how crude oil and petroleum fuels market mature over time, there is a spot market, there's a future market price. Right now, SAF is not there because SAF doesn't even have a price. In the future, when there is price visibility, a future market will form. And what they can do is use this future price to hedge their revenue, and then they can find financing more easily. They can also hedge their profits because of that, similar to how refineries hedge their margins. Then there's tradability across international markets. I think in Asia it's a lot more collaborative. Everyone is looking at CORSIA as a guideline for the standards and LCA. As long as all the countries in Asia follow the same CORSIA guided LCA, and as long as the carbon credits that are accepted in this recommended solution is also accepted by CORSIA, these fuel will become tradable within Asia. It lowers the cost of financing because the bankability is improved through the price visibility and ability to have a longer term offtake. Demand carve out in aviation.
Sorry, the slides are no longer showing.
Oh,
Sorry, in case we've missed out the last slide.
so this is the last point already. So it is really more for developers like us. We are also looking for markets similar to SAF producers. We are also looking for our market. So I think for me, I see SAF and DEC as complementary partners. We are complementing SAF to help reduce the carbon intensity, but through that endeavor, we are also able to find a market for ourselves. So with that, I'll show you our DAC project in the US. It's on the west coast of Texas. And this is taken, I think, 2 months ago. And you can see that we have this huge piece of land, which we have, I forgot if it's acquired or leased. Anyway, we're building on it. And not far from here are all the pipelines linking to the saline aquifers. And the two big parallel stacks here are the air contactors. This whole piece of land is acquired to build 4 of that. So you can see only 2 because we are only building out 2 right now. And for the next 2, we have already done a lot of R&D work to try to make it even more cost effective, thereby reducing the cost of each ton of CO2 that we sequester. So, so we are expected to have our startup end of this year. And we are still expecting it to happen. And what we've done is that we've commissioned different parts of it. If you are interested, I can talk more about it later if you have questions. But I also want to show you our history. We have not been around just, we've been around for a long time because CE has been around for a long time. They first built that pilot plant 10 years ago. There's an innovation center built in 2021. And then Occidental or 1.5 acquired the company 100%. And then now we have the license to build all over the world, including the US. And the construction is on its way. And the second plant is expected to be built in the south of Texas. Here you can see in King Ranch. And then in the future, hopefully we can build in Asia. And these are the companies that have already bought from us. We have more. This was updated it was this year, but we have already made more sales to companies, and we're very happy to share this with you. So that's it from me.
Pretty awesome. I think we need a plant like this in Singapore as well.
I think we won't
Yeah.
have Singapore if this is built here.
All
We need
right.
more
But
land.
all right. Thanks for really covering quite a bit about the concepts of CDR and how it can be used to kind of I would say promote liquidity and transparency for the SAF market.
Mm.
Actually, in many of our conversations with both industry and policymakers, unraveling, I guess, the concept of carbon intensities, it's quite challenging.
Yes.
Um, I think some may even question why we start with volume mandates, right? But even looking at what Europe is doing, they started with 2% SAF this year. It's not a perfect solution, obviously. I think it should evolve over time. We're really hearing conversations that to really make each pathway more viable, we need to reward those with much more improved technology with a lower CI score, which recovers obviously the cost of investment, right? With that, the flow, we actually have one question coming in, but there was something else about CORSIA eligibility feedstocks, not really about CDR per se. I don't think we'll take the question for now, but if again, audiences, you'd like to raise your hands to ask Sylvia, please do so. We can unmute you and you can talk. Fabrice, anything to add as well? I think we've been with the last carbon markets panel just a few weeks ago. How was it like? Yeah, just to kind of explain, uh, I would say the convergence of carbon markets and SAF. Yeah. Are we getting there yet?
Oh well, I think we're getting there. Maybe in some areas, but definitely not yet in Asia. And that's the beauty of, and that's why we need a SAFA, and that's what we need a SAFA's member like 1.5 is basically. We need to have this regional market where the ones that are using or reducing their emission can claim for CO2 carbon abatements. And I think that's where technologies like what 1.5 is promoting, I think is interesting. But overall, that's where also where you need to have somehow have an understanding of the carbon intensity of the SAF that you are using, so that you can average everything and compare on apple to apple. So there's room for improvement, and I think that's an interesting part of it. I'm hearing a lot of discussions about carbon markets in the region, more focusing on the domestic carbon markets, to be honest, at the moment. But I mean, the next step is to move into a bigger carbon markets, and that's where we're here, right? All of us. So we'll see, we'll see. But it's interesting discussions. Is growing, and again, I think what Sylvia mentioned and was very clear in our presentation is the more you decarbonize, you need to get a value for the biggest, for the highest decarbonization products, right? Unfortunately, there is no product today at the aviation level that decarbonizes 100% of fuel emissions. So you need potentially to bundle different solutions to reach that 100% decarbonization so far. So, and that's where it makes sense to bundle different technologies, products, SAF, of course, but then other products as well.
From the 1.5 team, anything else? Because we do have part two. So
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a very new concept.
Mhm.
Well, because the thing is that I think you mentioned someone was asking it's about CORSIA pathways. And I know I didn't see that question, but I think if I were to guess, there's many pathways in CORSIA that is outlined in CORSIA that are still very new. Like alcohol to jet it's quite new. We talk a lot about it, but that has yet to that in itself has its own pathway to scale and bring the cost down and whatnot. But I think that it helps to look ahead to understanding why is it so difficult to scale. It's not just about creating the technology, it's the feedstock. It's really about whether or not this business can grow and thrive. And you can't grow and thrive without these businesses making money. So the price is very important. So I really hope that over time, there can be more focus on this area, because it goes hand in hand with availability of feedstock as well and technologies. Yeah.
All right, I think we should carry on with part 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me cast the
Thank you
slides
from
for
Philip. Yeah, thanks
Philip.
for sharing the slides as well.
Oh, God. I don't know.
Otherwise,
Okay, I found it. Sorry.
okay.
Here we go. Okay. All right. So Philip, over to you.
Good. Thank you very much, Sylvia, and hello, everyone. It's good morning from the UK, but obviously much later in the day in Asia. Just by way of background, a few words about myself. Way back in the day, I set up and founded BP's biofuels business. So I have long experience and many scars on my back from trying to develop and build plants and work in markets to make biofuels a reality. Of course, in those days, it was overwhelmingly for the ground fuels market. I've also been heavily involved in other aspects of work across the renewable energy space for probably about 25 years now. So I've seen a lot, I've learnt a lot, and frankly, I've suffered a lot on the journey. But right now, what we wanted to do was just we thought it'd be a really nice idea to complement what Sylvia has just presented around how a market might evolve, with a little bit of an insight into what's actually happening in the one territory at the moment, really in the world, that has taken the principle of using carbon intensity as the key metric for thinking about how it defines SAF opportunities into the future. So it's the UK SAF mandate. I will declare an interest here and now. Personally, I think this is actually by far the best designed of any of the structures and mandates that we've seen anywhere so far. I hope that some other country comes up with an even better version, but I do think that right now this is setting a bit of a benchmark for how we should think about a future SAF market. Having said that, as we'll talk about, it doesn't mean that it's taken all of the problems and issues away. There is still a lot of work to be done before we can really claim success and victory in the area of creating SAF markets and having flourishing scaled SAF penetration of the aviation fuel sector and making a real difference to emissions. So, and my slides, I'm afraid, are very basic because I can't really do PowerPoint very well. I'm an old man. So there'll just be some bullet points that I'll talk through, but hopefully if you want to take them away as an aid memoir, they'll have some benefit for you. So Sylvia, could we go to the first slide, please? Thank you. So just some of the distinctive features about the SAF mandate in the UK. So, I mean, the first point is it absolutely is a mandate. It goes up to 2040. They haven't gone to the net zero by 2050 date that many people are talking about, largely because the view was that people aren't clear about how the market will evolve that far into the future. So they thought it was prudent to take it out to 2040, long enough to give a degree of forward certainty for investment without getting absolutely overcommitted to what a longer term and more uncertain future might look like. The mandate, as is typical with most mandate designs, progressively increases in terms of the obligation requirement. And so this year it started, and for this year we're at 2%. And it's expressed by volume, but we'll talk about how actually that's just a sort of a high level indicator. So it starts at 2% by 2030. Like Japan, we have to get to 10%. by 2035, 15%, and by 2040, 22% SAF penetration. So actually it starts comparing ourselves with the European Union. It's in the early years, we are more aggressive than the European Union. In the later years, we are less aggressive than the European Union in terms of the growth in the mandate. The obligated party is is basically the oil company. It's the fuel supplier. So it's Air BP or Shell Aviation or Esso, whoever it is who's running the hydrant at the airport. They are the people who have the obligation. Importantly, it is not the airline. And the UK and Europe, you know, they've been involved in the biofuels sector for a couple of decades now. And really, for historic reasons, they've got themselves really caught into concerns around sustainability and feedstock sustainability, particularly around the use of crops as feedstocks for biofuels. Personally, I think that this is still very unproven science, but nonetheless, because of NGO pressure, they have really foregrounded sustainability in how they've designed their market mechanisms and mandates, or perceived sustainability. So the way that that's played out in the UK SAF mandate is that effectively we have two obligations. There's what's called the main obligation, and then there's a separate obligation for PTL, so synthetic SAF. That is the same as the way that Europe has approached it. Where the UK has gone one step further is then to break down the main obligation into the amount that is allowed to be used by heifer, and then an area that is not accessible to heifer pathways. And it's actually the conversion technology, not the feedstock, that is used to define the heifer cap. Okay, so which I think is a slight problem, but so the heifer cap starts, we're at sort of 100%. So in the very earliest days of the UK mandate, all of it can be met using heifer. But as time goes on, that heifer cap really starts to bite. So as the overall mandate level increases, the proportion that is allowed to come from heifer significantly declines. So this year, 100% of the mandate is heifer. By 2040, it's about a quarter. Okay, so there's actually a curve in terms of heifer demand, and I think one of the interesting consequences is that it creates a clear standalone sub-market for non-heifer technologies, which will be priced against other non-heifer technologies. So a reason to feel positive about this, it may sound a little bit counterintuitive, but a reason to feel positive about it is that it is a mechanic to accelerate the introduction of alternative and more diverse SAF pathways than we would see in other markets where there's no differentiation, and really the non-heifer pathways will only start to become economically viable and price in once the price of heifer has gone up to a point where you know there is room for competition. And the challenge there is how on earth you get to scale and the economies of scale when you're waiting for heifer to allow yourself to be priced in. So so I think it's quite an interesting and important nuance in the design. It does enable the UK to potentially be a launch pad for scaling up and testing alternative technologies, perhaps starting with alcohol to jet, but going into some of the MSW gasification and other pathways. The risk is that it means that the UK in the medium term is uniquely exposed to the undersupply of these technologies. So you know, it's a brave path. I think it's overall it's a it's a good thing to have done, but it's not without risk. If you don't reach the obligation levels, so if the mandate is not hit, a buyout price applies. And so there is a clear penalty. And that is set for the main obligation, so whether it's heifer or this other stuff, at £4.70 a litre. And it's a little bit higher, £5 for PTL. So this does two things. On the one hand, it sort of caps the exposure that the airline passenger has to non-compliance on SAF, right? So it sets a cap on the overall price of SAF. It also gives you a very good indication of the willingness to pay that a SAF producer should have when compared with other applications for a technology or a pathway or a feedstock. So our assumption, based on what we've seen in other similar mandate mechanisms, is that when the market is short, the market will tend to price towards or close to the buyout price. But when the market is well supplied, of course, it will tend to price over time at the cost of production of the marginal ton of SAF. Except in the UK SAF mandate, as Sylvia explained earlier, although a lot of the headline language is in volumes, 10% of SAF should be, actually the key metric is carbon intensity. And the way that works is, I think, just to reiterate some of what Sylvia was saying earlier, a certificate which is used to prove your performance against the obligation, against the mandate, is generated not by supplying a litre of SAF, but it is supplying an amount of emissions reduction. And that is assessed at a producer giving a product, or it's benchmarked at a product that delivers a 70% saving, as Sylvia was saying, against fossil jet kerosene. And so, as you can see there, almost 30 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule. So that's the benchmark level. So a litre of SAF at that benchmark carbon intensity generates a certificate. And if you have a lower CI, so if it's a higher generator of emission savings, then you'll get more than one certificate, and a litre with a worse carbon performance will generate less than. And the benchmark, right, the cutoff point is a 60% saving, right? So a carbon intensity of 40% of that of fossil kerosene. That is really important, because what that means in pricing terms is that rather, in a long market, a well-supplied market, rather than the price being set by the cost of the marginal litre, it's set by the cost of the marginal certificate. And therefore, and that is how I expect the carbon value to start to play out and reward people, because anyone who has got a certificate cost less than the marginal one will obviously show a higher profit. And so there is an incentive both to reduce physical production cost, but also to maximize carbon saving. It means that, in effect, the UK mandate isn't saying that in 2030 we want to have 10% SAF. It's saying, in effect, we want the emissions from the aviation fuel that is burnt to be reduced by 7%. Okay, so that's the message there. So And yeah, so and the main obligation, sorry, is a subset because I mentioned 22%. That was overall, including PTL. So excluding PTL, it goes up to 18.5% in 2040. And the volumes, though, will actually be a function of the CI that's produced. So if you have very, very low CI, right, very high performing from a carbon intensity point of view, SAF in the mix, then you'll need much less of it to meet that target clearly than you will. And again, that's just repeating effectively the message that we heard from Sylvia earlier. Another very important nuance here is that negative emissions are allowed and do count. And therefore, at the moment, if you are able to use point carbon sequestration, so point CCS, then that can count towards the CI performance of your product. Where the UK hasn't yet gone is to allow the purchasing of certificates that are not directly connected with point source capture at the point of production of the CO2. But the mechanism is there at the moment to directly reward not just the carbon that's sort of intrinsic to the SAF itself, but also the carbon reduction that comes from capturing CO2 from the production process. So it does raise the prospect of having volumes of negative CO2 SAF playing into the mandate with a therefore and that offsets an awful lot of the extra cost that may be involved in producing such volumes. So it creates a very interesting set of potential market dynamics. A couple of words then on, if we could move on to the next one, Sylvia.
Sure.
Oh, and sorry, before I go, there is one other thing to bear in mind around carbon and carbon markets and their impacts on how we expect to see the UK and to an extent the European market, although the European market is absolutely a volume mandate at the moment. But both markets have started to apply ETS. And the ETS is being applied for internal European flights at a much more aggressive rate than Corsia. So there is another incentive there to reduce the overall emissions from aviation, because obviously the lower emissions that you're showing, the less the ETS penalty will be on the fuel that you're flying. So in the UK, effectively, we have got two carbon intensity related levers, ETS and the SAF mandate. In Europe, it's at the moment at least just the ETS exposures. So if we now could actually, sorry, if there's the next slide, Sylvia, please.
Sure.
Very quickly then, I thought I'd just talk about some of the things that the UK is doing around supply side support for developing the industry. So they've put in place a SAF clearinghouse, which is basically trying to support new developers of new technologies and understanding what they need to do to get ASTM approvals and so forth. So it's very much a sort of a technology support mechanism. Europe has got something very similar. There is something called the Advanced Fuels Fund, which provides direct grants to developers of new technologies to try and support the technology pathways to meet the amount of the obligation that is not covered, that goes beyond the heifer cap. And I think most intriguingly, there is something called a revenue certainty mechanism. So the revenue certainty mechanism is being designed, and it's now locked into law as something that the UK has to produce, has been designed because there was a lot of feedback that investors were unhappy with the amount of revenue risk that they were seeing in the SAF space. Largely because this is a new market, it's very unformed. Sylvia mentioned herself that price formation and price discovery is highly immature. And when investors were comparing, therefore, investments in SAF with other things that they could do in their in their green portfolio, they felt that this was uniquely high risk. The response in the UK has been this idea of a revenue certainty mechanism. The headlines have been defined. The detail, and the detail is really important, but the detail is still being worked on. But the headline is that it's similar to a contract for difference mechanism, something that we've seen in the wind sector and other places quite frequently. The fuel supplier is the counterparty. There's going to be it's going to be administered by an independent government body, it's open to qualifying non-HEFA developers only, and I should say non-HEFA UK developers only. So you can only get this support if you're developing a technology that is not HEFA, and you can only qualify for this if you're doing it in Britain. It is explicitly designed to try and promote investment in UK manufactured SAF. The way that it works is that the developer accepts a strike price, if the market price for SAF is higher than the strike price, then the settlement period is over. The developer has to pay the difference back to the administrator. So basically, the strike price is their guaranteed price, and if it's lower, the supplier pays the difference to the developer. Okay, so effectively, therefore, it means the developer has a guaranteed price. And you could argue that by sacrificing exposure to the upside against that price, they are buying an insurance against the downside. And so in setting the strike price, it's very important that the developer thinks about what number it is that will give them the security of return that their investors are looking for. So what else has been agreed? Well, it's been agreed that settlement will be annual. Initial funding if it turns out that prices are lower than strike prices, and therefore the scheme has to pay out. An initial levy is being raised on all aviation fuel supplies in the UK, so that can then be used to fund any payments that the scheme needs to make to developers. And that money is collected and held by the fuel supply. So it's simply a levy that's placed on all aviation fuel sales. Now, there's a lot of detail that still needs to be worked through. So the first one is tenor. How long will this last? The second is, what is the mechanism for establishing a strike price, particularly when at the moment, there is no clear market pricing activity, and there are lots of divergent pathways that are in place with potentially radically differing prices. It's not like offshore wind, where there is a sort of a similarity of technology. What is the scope? So what proportion of the mandate should be covered by this scheme? Should it be all of it? Should it be only a third of it? And the implications of both are quite interesting. So if it's only a small amount, then on the one hand, it means that its primary purpose will be to support a small number of promising technologies to get to maturity. On the other hand, it will do little to reduce supply risk and mandate delivery risk. But if you go to covering the whole of the supply requirement with this mechanism, then any tension around where to put the strike price will disappear, and people just name a strike price that's 2, 3, 4x the number they really need, or they'll just put the strike price straight at the buyout price, and so there won't be any competitive tension in establishing strike prices. How do you establish what a market price is for SAF? We have an early Argus price quote for HEFA in Europe, a Rotterdam HEFA quote. It's not a very deep, not very not massively robust, but at least it's there. There isn't any kind of quote at the moment for this UK unique specific sub-market for non-HEFA SAF, but that's the market price that would need to be used in the settlement process. And then what happens to the scheme revenues if the scheme becomes in surplus? What should happen to those revenues? Should they be held back as a pot to fund any future costs? Should they be distributed back to airlines so that they can be used to reduce airline, ticket prices? That's not yet decided. So these details are really critical, and the government's working on them. Lastly, then, and if we could go to the next slide, Sylvia, please.
Sure.
So final slide. What are some of the issues that we're seeing now that we're 9 months into the UK mandate? So one of the problems is this issue of regulatory arbitrage. So at the moment, clearly almost everyone that can make HEFA can make HVO. There's a large degree of interchangeability, both with feedstocks and processing, and we have quite mature markets in Europe and the UK for the use of HVO in ground fuels, but they have very different market mechanisms. So there is a degree of regulatory arbitrage that's going on, and that's creating some internal inefficiencies in terms of pricing between the ground fuels markets and the aviation markets. Now, the good news there is that the UK government acknowledges this and is starting to think about how it can better align its ground fuels market rules with its SAF market rules. So at least they're playing on a sort of a similar playing field, and that should, in theory, advantage SAF, because the buyout price is very high in SAF, of course, and so therefore a willingness to pay is going to be greater. Price discovery. Because the oil company is the obligated party, they are at the moment highly focused on the risks that they see in the event of non-delivery or non-performance against the mandate. And so that's creating some very conservative responses in terms of premiums that are being put on wholesale SAF prices when it gets to the point of sale to the airline. And this is because the oil companies are really trying to make sure that they've got complete coverage against any downside risk that may be there. It could be that they are overestimating the size and scale of that risk, because the premiums that are being charged, anecdotally at least, feel quite high. But nonetheless, this is a response to the uncertainty that we're seeing as we're in these very early days of price discovery and seeing how this market really works in practice. There is growing concern about the validity of what's called the waste-only constraints. So effectively, in both Europe and the UK, you can only use feedstocks that are designated as waste. It's a response to that concern that I mentioned earlier around sustainability. And the silver bullet solution, the convenient solution that the regulators came up with, was to say you can only use waste. The challenge is, of course, what is waste? What is the real value of waste? And what are the unintended consequences of creating premium markets for waste products? And to an extent, there is a concern that's already happening with used cooking oil sourced from the East Asian and Southern Asian markets. And so that's raising concerns and is creating some thought both amongst the NGO community, but also more broadly. There is, at the very least, a potential for a price fly-up as a separate waste UCO kind of category becomes even more in demand as these mandates increase. But there may also be other constraints, including countries determining that they actually don't want to see this stuff being exported anymore, but they'd rather use it for their own, to support their own domestic industries. So this feels like this feels like Europe potentially and the UK potentially creating a real problem for themselves. The UK response has been to issue a call for evidence to investigate the possibility of diversifying feedstocks, and this essentially is around allowing in sugar and starch ethanol into an ethanol to jet pathway to complement and sort of provide a strategic risk against something going wrong with the existing heifer supply chains. We are really struggling with getting investment into non-heifer pathways. We need 3 to 5 of roughly 3 to 5 non-heifer production facilities up and running by 2030, and no one is close to FID yet. And this is all to do with those concerns around risk that we were talking about. It's why the RCM is so important. The question is whether it'll be too late and whether it's going to be sufficient to really unleash the high risk investment that's going to be necessary to get the first of kind plants up and running with these new technologies. And as you can see, I've already mentioned some of this, but the response, I think the UK government is doing its best to respond to these things. As I said, thinking about diversifying feedstocks, intensifying effort on RCM design, and trying to remove the or address the regulatory arb exposure that exists today between ground fuels and SAF. So early days. I think there's a lot to build on, but Rome wasn't built in a day. There is still a lot more to do. There's still a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of risk ahead of us if we want to get to a point where SAF is really living up to the potential that we all believe that it has to support decarbonisation. But really importantly, it's an example of where using carbon intensity as the metric opens up opportunities to enhance the performance of SAF and reduce the volumetric dependence on SAF, and therefore potentially the aggregate cost of compliance by including carbon removal, whether initially through point source carbon removal or potentially ultimately allowing and enabling certificates to be purchased as an important risk mitigator and cost reducer on the journey to delivering what's really important here, which is not litres of SAF per se, but reduced emissions from aviation overall. I'll leave it there and happy to answer any questions.
Wow, it's quite a bit to unpack, really. Sylvia, you had some questions within the chat as well, right? You want to
Yeah,
read those out?
I post some questions.
Yeah.
Thank you, Philip, for your very detailed and very educational slides. I really enjoyed them. I have two questions for you. The first one is, what is the ETS obligation for someone like British Airways from the UK? Is it more or less aggressive than CORSIA? What I mean by that is, if British Airways were to comply to CORSIA reductions targets already, will they have to do more to then meet ETS obligations?
So for international, for if you will, blue water flights, right? So intercontinental flights, CORSIA applies. For flights within the UK and within the European Union, the local ETS applies, which is more aggressive.
Oh, it's
So it
more.
depends on where the flight is going to. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay, thank you. And then my second question is regarding the RCM. What is to prevent suppliers in the UK from setting a very high strike price, given that there are so few of them at the moment?
Well, that's the whole how do you set the strike price dilemma. The rational way of doing it would be to effectively put in place some form of reverse auction. And so you put a limit on how much capacity can benefit from the RCM. And then you basically say the strike price applies to everyone at the marginal strike price that is offered in an auction process. And that's certainly the way that it works in things like the wind sector and other renewables.
And
Um,
that would be
yeah.
open to more than just UK producers outside as well, to levels that where the market level is, or just the UK?
No, the problem, the issue at the moment is that this scheme is
Yes.
explicitly intended to support UK. So really only UK invest, people who are intending to invest in building a plant in the UK is that they're the target market.
Thank you.
Okay, but clearly it would be capped, right, at the buyout price. And then how much lower it would be than that depends on the economics of the marginal liter that's going to be put into the scheme.
Yeah.
Now, there are calls though that actually, for the very first ones, this should be done not through such a process, but for sort of the reasons that you were discussing, Sylvia, there, because it's such a thin market. Actually, it should be through bilateral negotiation between a consultant, an expert consultant, from representing the scheme and individual developers.
Yeah. Without spelling it out, if I were one of the limited number of producers in the UK, if I were to submit a price, I would submit it very close to the buyout price. And then
Yeah. And that's where the negotiation would have to come in. Yeah, and so that's where if there was a limited amount of capacity though,
yeah,
then you would be you would worry about doing that because you might find that other people have gone lower than you.
right,
And so there's a little bit of game theory going on.
right,
But if you take that competitive tension away, then exactly you're into justifying why you should be getting, £4.68 a litre.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions I have. I do have one thing to say at the end of this. I think that the UK has come up with a very interesting policy. I don't know how much time people have put into this, but I think it's a lot. I think that Asia is slightly different because I think there are so many countries that make up Asia where you have countries that are actually very rich in feedstocks, and especially in feedstock that can make HEFA. So designing a mechanism that is applicable for more than one country in Asia would be more suitable. And I think a version of what the UK has done would be good, which is a carbon intensity based SAF. But I think the recommendation that we have is on the threshold would actually fit being able to be more inclusive across countries within the region of Asia. So that's why I just want to put it out there for consideration. Yeah. Over to you, Gabriel and Fabrice. I think we end here since there's no other questions. Thank you
Yes.
so much to Kimori for joining. I thought there would be many more questions, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, today the audience has been a bit quiet, to be honest. We have a question about the SAP registry, GHG order, and RFTO. Not sure if you guys want to answer that.
Can we see the questions?
Yes, you can go on the
It's a
Q&A.
very specific to the UK situation.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah,
So it's
there's
potentially
a
for
clarification,
Philip.
with the where does a SAF sit in, right? Does it sit in the RFTO database separately? Philip, I'm not aware what's the current.
No, not specialist either. So
Philip, do you see the question?
Yeah.
Where does it sit, right? The SAF, it sits in the.
Yeah. Sorry, right. I've got it. Right. So the RTFO, that's the acronym for the Road Transport Fuel Obligation. And that was the until the SAF mandate came in, that was effectively the UK biofuels market setting mechanism. And it included in there, if you were making a little bit of SAF, you could count it under the RTFO rules, which are different, remember, from the SAF mandate rules. Now that the SAF mandate exists, SAF no longer qualifies under RTFO because it is a different market mechanism. It only qualifies under the SAF mandate. So yes, I think I can confirm that point.
Okay, thank you very much, Philip. Very clear. All right, so I think we've been extended a bit, so we have we have another question. So thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Pleasure. I mean, that's how we do. So yeah, I mean, thanks again to the two of you, Sylvia and Philip, for sharing your views and your ideas on how to make SAF, if I increase SAF adoption in the region, and also how to make sure that when we talk about SAF, then we also focus first on reducing the carbon emissions of the aviation, and I think that's key, because that's how the targets that we are all want to achieve, right? Sugimori-san, thank you also for joining us. So the webinar will be available online as usual, okay, on the YouTube. Don't hesitate, for the one we were there, to share with your colleagues or with other people. We are very interested in those things. I think the UK mandate, as Philippe mentioned, is potentially today the most advanced policies that we have around the world. Good ideas to look into it and to deep dive into it for our regional policies, and need to adapt it, of course, to a specificity of Asia. But I think that's something interesting. And of course, on that mandate, we're talking about carbon intensity, which is the ultimate goal that we all want to achieve. Thank you very much again, all of you, to join. Thank you to our dear 1.5 partners and members for joining us today. And we give you a rendezvous in 1 month for the next webinars. In the meantime, stay tuned, and happy to have you further questions from you guys on the social media or on our website. Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Gabrielle wanted me to say something.
No, it's like, thank you.
Bye.
Yeah, bye.